Hi there, my name is Dr. Amy Grant and I am a Wellcome Trust Career Development Fellow at Swansea University. I'm based in the Centre for Lactation, Infant Feeding and Translation. Let's just move myself a little bit so you can see all of the logo. I'm also the co-founder and co-chair of the Documents Research Network, the Autistic Health Research Network, and I'm the research lead for the Maternity and Autism Research Group. You can follow my work on Twitter at Dr. Amy Grant, and I use the hashtag #ActuallyAutistic. So that's something you see the autistic community using quite frequently. And you can also follow my research on Facebook. So there is a group, Dr. Amy Grant, from Autism from Menstruation to Menopause. So this talk, which I've titled From Fatigue to Fellowship, was originally planned to be part of the International Women's Day celebrations at Swansea University. Unfortunately, due to snow, it was cancelled. But I've had some people reach out and say that they're applying for Wellcome Career Development Fellowships in the April round, so that they'd like to see my talk anyway. So let me just move on and I'll show you a little bit about what I'm going to cover today. And let's put myself back up in the corner. So yes, to start with, I'll give you an overview to disability and autism through a social model lens, and I'll then talk a little bit about my life before academia, my move into academia, and then when my health imploded. So you can't see it so well in this small video, but I'm a wheelchair user, and yes, so things went very wrong with my work and health simultaneously, and then I moved to Swansea University in 2021. I was originally asked to give this talk focusing on how I was successful in securing a £2.4 million Wellcome Trust Fellowship. So then most of the talk then will focus on what I put in my fellowship application, and a three-pronged attack that you can use when you're designing your own research projects, and particularly fellowships, to make sure that you come across as looking really competitive. So let's start off then, and I can't get my slides to move on, there we are, to thinking first of all a little bit about disability and society. So before the Second World War, we had a real medicalised focused view of what disability was. So if there was any kind of problem when it came to disability, it was very much seen as residing with that individual person who had the disability. So it was thought that, for example, referring to myself being in a wheelchair, the barriers around that would be that my legs don't work, rather than actually thinking that society needs to be accessible for people in wheelchairs, for example, by using ramps, as you can see from the image on the side of the screen, that went along with some protests. So moving into the social model of disability, this really came about after World War II. And we do see significant progress in how disability is understood and treated following wars, because that's when you have these generally young, able-bodied people going off to fight in wars, and they go out very physically fit and strong, and they come back sometimes with some very severe disabilities. So after World War II, we saw this idea that the problem couldn't have been with the soldiers, it was that the environment should be adapted so those soldiers could still get around. And we saw disability really thought of in terms of physicality at that point. But actually more recently we've seen more emphasis on mental health and neurodivergence. So that's things like being autistic or dyslexic, ADHD, dyspraxic, having Tourette's, these sorts of things. So when we have an environment that's said to disable people, the response to that isn't that that person should just have to stay at home and never be seen. It is that support should be put in place to remove those barriers. So in 2010, the UK had a new Equality Act, and that brought together lots of the equality legislation from the 1960s, and it strengthens it. And this quote comes from the .gov website, and it says, and this is focused on employers, but it also applies to public services, that reasonable adjustments must be made so that people with disabilities or physical or mental health conditions are not substantially disadvantaged. So reasonable adjustments and substantially disadvantaged are really key parts of this. So as well as being a wheelchair user, I'm also autistic. And we can also think about autism through a medical model and a social model of disability. So on the left-hand side of the slide, you can see that within a medical model, we often see a triad of impairments or a triad of deficits being referred to. And when I was in my early 20s, I worked as a support worker for autistic people living in residential care. And because of the way the language that was phrased around these deficits or impairments, there was no way that I could recognise myself in that. So these impairments are described as being in relation to inappropriate social interaction, communication that is deficient, and using restrictive or repetitive behaviours. Now, anybody that watches Dragon's Den will probably have noticed that Deborah Meaden is often shown touching her fingernails during their discussions. That sort of thing is known as a stim, and I'm not saying in any way that Deborah Meaden is or isn't autistic, but those sorts of things can be really small and minimal and not harming anybody at all. But under a medical model, they're pathologized. It's said that they're wrong, they're restricted, they're repetitive, not that they're soothing and they're calming. And when we're thinking about autism through a medical model, neuronormativity is expected. So people should all behave in the same way, and eye contact is something that autistic people often do quite differently. So when autistic people are rated by non-autistic people, they're considered to be more deceitful than a neurotypical person, even though research shows that autistic people tend to be more altruistic and less comfortable with lying. But these different ways that we communicate are seen as us being inauthentic, as us being deceitful or deficient in some way. And that leads to autistic people doing something known as masking. And that is basically like method acting. So autistic people will observe people who are behaving in ways that are considered socially desirable, and they'll work out how to behave in that same way. But when you're spending energy doing that, you can't spend your energy on other things as well. If we apply a social model of disability to autism, instead of deficits, we see differences. And I've screenshotted a tweet here that I really like from Maura Campbell, who says, autism is a lifelong condition often characterised by an inability to bullshit. So we generally are not good at telling lies, a pathological need for fairness, and that social justice really fits within me, a compulsion to help others, absolutely recognise that, an inexplicable need to expose hypocrisy, I'm definitely on that as well, and then an excessive tendency to let other people be, to let them just do what they want. And the sign off is there is no known cure, because actually lots of people think autism should be cured. So often people known as autism moms, so the mothers of autistic children, particularly in America, and neurotypical autism researchers. But large surveys have shown that around 80% of autistic people would not take a cure for autism if it was offered. So that shows that along with these differences, actually autistic people really like those traits that they see in themselves on the social model side of that slide. So thinking a little bit about me, and let's move myself over here so I don't block the lovely cartoon from Ortball. So autism is a lifelong disability. You're either autistic or you're not. So the cartoon on the side of the slide is tongue-in-cheek. You know, somebody saying this person is autistic, the other person says I'm sorry, and that you must be devastated because they won't ever do these things and it's all just hopeless. And the first person goes, yeah, maybe try asking some questions next time. Because actually the person hasn't changed. Nothing has changed about that person. They've just had a label applied to them. Something that is much more useful to consider in terms of disabilities is Luke Bearden's autism equation. So he says that autism plus environment equals outcome. So taking my own autistic traits from that right-hand side of the slide, and I promise we're circling around to the fellowship, we'll be there in the next few minutes, then actually in primary school, I had a really supportive environment and I won an award for citizenship at the end of school when I didn't even know what that word meant, because those helpful traits, those supporting other people, those kindness traits were really seen positively there. But in other environments, actually the fact that my eye contact might be a bit different, or that I might prefer, not to be too close to people that I don't know too well, might actually be seen as deficient and that there's something wrong with me there. So as well as being autistic, I've mentioned that I'm a wheelchair user, and that comes from this common package of co-occurring conditions that many autistic people have. So I have really quite serious allergies, I'm hypermobile, and that's resulted in me needing 2 ankle ligament surgeries, and I also have dysautonomia, which thankfully is quite well controlled with medication these days, but previously I'd have not very much notice that either I needed to lie on the ground and put my feet up in the air, or I was going to fall over. So that's kind of a bit about my disabilities, and those things have always been there for me, but in times of stress they definitely get worse. So let's start talking about my journey towards this fellowship. So I've mentioned already that I was a support worker for autistic people in my early 20s, and I then went to university as a mature student. Like many autistic people, I couldn't pick a course to study, so I think I applied 4 or 5 times before I actually went to university. And I applied for a different course every time and different universities every time. But in the end, I settled on social policy and criminology. So that's really thinking about that fairness and social justice slant. When I was at university, I really found my people. So in other groups of people at work and in educational context, I'd been bullied. I hadn't had a strong group of friends. But actually at university, I thrived. And so I really didn't want to leave. I didn't want to go into work and risk being in that hostile environment. So autism plus a hostile environment equals a bad outcome, but I had a really positive environment at university. So I applied and was awarded places to study teacher training and also to do a PhD that was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. And I picked the PhD because it lasted for longer and it paid more. So that was literally the only reason. I could have flipped a coin. And then after I finished my PhD, so you're in the period known as being a postdoc, I worked as a research assistant on 2 projects at different universities, but I didn't find them that interesting. And the thing that was really missing was trying to make society better for marginalised groups. So I then moved into working for a public health charity focused on tobacco, and then I was asked to apply for a job in the NHS. So again, working in public health as a researcher. The reason there's a picture of a dog on the side of the screen, this is my first dog, Rico, and as a child I had always wanted a dog. Pretty much every birthday and Christmas I always asked and I never got one. One year I got a hamster and was very disappointed. But this NHS job that I was asked to apply for and offered gave me a permanent contract. And that's something you don't get often in academia. So I took that job so I could get a mortgage, so I could get a house, so I could get the dog that I'd wanted for 30 years or so. And I thought that was it, that I was done with academia. But then I'd been working with an outstanding public health consultant, Professor Shantini Paranjothi, and she had a job going at the university that she was based at. So she was partly in the NHS and partly in the university. So I then moved back into academia in 2013. And the picture of me you can see on the side of the slide shows that at this time I was doing really well. So I spent a lot of time out walking in the countryside. Those hypermobile ankles that needed surgery had been repaired, but I still had to walk with sticks when I was on rough terrain. But this research fellow job that I took was my first experience of being really disabled in work. So I'd been given software for my dyslexia as a PhD student, and when my university computer was upgraded to Windows 7, nothing worked as it should have. And I reported this to IT multiple times and I didn't get any help. And mentioned this to my manager, and just nothing was getting done. And in the end, it had been almost 6 months. And I'd just been trying harder and harder and harder and harder to keep up with my workload. And in the end, I couldn't read. So I literally couldn't differentiate what was a letter and what was a word. And at that point, I was referred to Access to Work. These days, the disabled person has to refer themselves. But back then, I think HR or occupational health were able to do it for me. And I had an assessment by an educational psychologist who understood all of my neurodivergent traits better than I had. And at the time, I only had the label of dyslexia. I wasn't diagnosed as autistic until my late 30s. But that assessor got me software that worked, got me some study skills coaching, and also importantly recommended a single occupancy office for me. And that worked brilliantly. Everything went well. I was a co-applicant on several big grants, and then there was a programme of redundancies in our department. My manager was able to advocate for me and some of her other researchers to stay on and to be given teaching and research contracts, so being a lecturer rather than a research fellow. But unfortunately, I would have had to have moved into a different team to do that. And my research was focused on pregnancy and infant feeding, and the new team would have been focused on child abuse. And that is such an important area of research, but it's one that I knew that I couldn't do, that I would make myself feel really quite unwell if I was working and hearing such horrific stories of abuse day in, day out. And so for that reason, I moved to a new department. And everything was going well. I was running long distance. I was in a running club. I was in a walking club. Everything was going well at that point. But unfortunately, those reasonable adjustments that had been agreed in one part of the university were then questioned in the new part. And this is where things started to go really wrong for me. So I'd been diagnosed as having asthma as a child, and we'd always known that I was allergic. But in quite a short period of time, I went from being quite well controlled with my asthma to having very serious attacks, leading to somewhere between about 12 and 20 trips to accident and emergency in an ambulance. And that was terrifying. And my asthma consultant, who I'd been discharged from almost a decade before, said this was really serious and you could die within 10 minutes of an attack starting. Unfortunately, the directors of the research centre I worked in thought that colleagues who complained it would distress them to phone an ambulance for me when I was having an asthma attack and unable to speak. They thought that that was more important than my consultant saying that I could die within 10 minutes. And this led to me being pushed out of the workspace. So at that time, I wasn't able to join any meetings that happened, so nobody would make it possible for me to phone into meetings or Skype, as it probably would have been back then, into meetings. So I was just kind of pushed out, and I tried really hard to advocate for my reasonable adjustment for a single occupancy office initially, and then for adjustments so I would always have some support. If I were to have an asthma attack, I would know, for example, the names of first aiders. I would have been able to give the first aiders a briefing in advance when I was able to talk. And those things went on for about 3 years. And starting in about 2017, I started developing periods of quite long fatigue. And actually, by about mid-2018, they just didn't stop. And that is why I now use a wheelchair. In 2018, I was referred to the NHS wheelchair service by my GP practice nurse, but they rejected me because I could very slowly and painfully, whilst experiencing shortness of breath, walk the about 20 metres from the disabled parking space at my GP surgery into the surgery. And so being able to do that once a week meant that I wasn't disabled enough to get a wheelchair on the NHS. I was successful in being awarded personal independence payment, and that then funded the wheelchair that I had to buy myself. And the picture on this slide is me in my wheelchair. This is the first day that it arrived. I'd moved house probably 18 months before this, and I live right next to a park, and I'd never been to the park since we'd moved house because I just couldn't walk to get there. So I got an old man on a bench to take a photo of me because I was so happy. So this is when things started going really wrong. And then actually I felt things took a real turn when I moved to working at Swansea University. And there were two main reasons here, I think. So I started working at Swansea in March 2021, and COVID lockdowns meant that people were so used to working from home, having Zoom meetings. So all of these things that I'd been asking for before that were too much actually just became normal. Also, Professor Amy Brown is my manager, and we'd worked together. Back in 2013, we worked on a large NIHR funded project. We were both co-applicants on that. So when Professor Brown had a job available, I was definitely applying, and fortunately I was awarded that role. And the remit for that role was something that I think was really important in terms of my health improving, because they were all things I knew I could do really well. So I was applying for external funding, I was doing research, and I was writing papers. A And I had a really successful first year. So I was on a fixed term 12-month contract. Just referencing Kermit in a sink full of money on the slides, I wanted a picture of a woman in a bath full of money to represent me with all of these grants. But the women were all were all designed to look sexy in bikinis or lingerie, and the men were all in business suits. So I went for the middle ground of Kermit, because even though he's a woman, he's a man, he's got his feminist girlfriend, Miss Piggy, to make sure that he's not being misogynistic. But anyway, so in year one, and all of these were working with Professor Amy Brown as co-applicants, I secured 2.6 million in grant income as principal investigator. And this all started with these small pots of money. So in my first week, the Research Wales Innovation Fund, which is an internal Swansea University fund, had a call. I applied for £5,000, and that let me do my first piece of research on autistic infant feeding experiences. So I had Dr. Sarah Jones come and work as a research officer, and together we did a systematic review. The next piece of money, so only £10,000, again an internal Swansea pot of money, the Accelerate Health Tech Centre, and that let me carry on that work. So it let me have Rebecca Ellis work with me on a realist review of an intervention that NICE says will improve accessibility of healthcare systems to autistic people. And we found that really wasn't the case, and also a survey of autistic people's maternity care experiences. And these are what my fellowship was really built on, these two small projects. Separately, I also had success with UKRI and the Food Standards Agency and the Medical Research Council, but they weren't to do with autistic infant feeding, they were infant feeding more generally. And then in the November of my first year, so I started in March, I knew I was basically almost at the 5-year eligibility criteria for the Health and Care Research Wales Health Fellowship. So I knew it was now or never. So that had a deadline in November. And also I knew I was on a 12-month fixed contract, so I really needed to get a big chunk of money. So I also applied for a Wellcome Trust Career Development Award, and that's more of a mid-career fellowship. So I was successful with that, and that awarded me £2.4 million, which is being spent on my salary for 8 years and having 4 full-time researchers working with me. And so I've got a really brilliant team of researchers that are now coming on board for that study. And the thing that I think is probably most important to the people watching this is, why do I think I got that fellowship? And I feel like you need all of that background to contextualise me and my research before we got here. But something that you often hear being said in relation to fellowships is that people need to think about the 3 Ps, and that is the person, the place, and the project. So I'll just talk a little bit about these now, but then I'll show you part of my interview presentation that I did for the Wellcome Trust. So in terms of the person, the project that I proposed directly built on my research achievements, and that was both in terms of my methodological expertise as a qualitative researcher. So I've written methods papers on using the sorts of methods I was using, and I've also written 2 qualitative research textbooks that were relevant to the research, and also my empirical research. So the topics I've studied were mostly around pregnancy and infant feeding, and my fellowship built on that. Second, coming to our second P, place. It was really important that I was in a place where I was going to be My fellowship is based in the LIFT Research Centre, so Lactation, Infant Feeding and Translation, which Professor Brown is the director of. And she's done phenomenally well in terms of translating her research into findings in the real world. So that was something that was really important that I hadn't necessarily done so much of myself. And then on top of that, I had a really outstanding advisory board. And you'll see more about that when I get into the fellowship presentation. And then lastly, the project. So you need to be really clear why your project is super, super important and why that is particularly now. And I gave a really clear rationale for why it needed to be done and why it needed to be done by me and using the methods I proposed. And so I showed my research design. I backed it up with references, some coming from my own work, and I really centered the autistic community. And I costed my project appropriately. So that meant that if I said I was going to do 1,000 interviews, which is exactly what I said, I had money in the budget to transcribe them. I had money to be able to post people out resource packs. I had costed to buy resources for people. So all of those little things add up when you're doing a big project. And then also, as well as the 3 Ps, I think you need to centre your funder. And the Wellcome Trust were really interested in people having highly ambitious projects. So that was exactly what I pitched to them. So let's move on to the beginning of my fellowship presentation. So before this, I had a title slide and then an introduction to what I was going to cover. I also used artwork from autistic artists, and I acknowledged them on the slides as well. And I think that probably made it look more interesting. So there was always something interesting to look at on the slides. And none of the slides look like each other, just to keep the panel's interest going. So the first major thing I talked about was my research achievements. So I talked about how I had experience of undertaking research on marginalised groups' health, and that the focus of that for most of my postdoctoral research was pregnancy and early motherhood. And I think at the time I had 16 first author publications in that area. Next, I mentioned that I'm a qualitative research methods expert. So that included that I am the co-founder and co-chair of the Documents Research Network, that I've written 2 documentary analysis textbooks, and also that I have written methods papers on using visual and creative methods. And all of those research elements will be used in my fellowship project. And then moving on to the right-hand side of the screen, the last thing that I brought up, because it is the most critical to my fellowship, is that I'd started doing research on autistic experiences of maternity. So that first grant for £5,000 was where Sarah Jones joined me so we could undertake a systematic review of autistic infant feeding. And the first image there in that box is of the first page of that journal article. And then the second image is of the recruitment poster for that second project. So it was only £10,000. You know, we're only thinking about £15,000 of seed funding that then led to me getting this fellowship. And then moving on next, I talked about the rationale for the project. So I talked about there being 1 to 2% of people being autistic, and we now have more recent data saying 1 in 44 is more likely, so over 2%, and that autistic people have worse health outcomes routinely. And I talked about things like us having an earlier death rate. So autistic people without learning disabilities die 16 years earlier than those who are not autistic, and autistic people with learning disabilities die 31 years earlier. So it's huge. We have huge health disparities. Autistic people are twice as likely to go to accident and emergency, so the emergency department for American colleagues. So we've got this issue that we really clearly can see. And we also know that autistic adults are generally excluded from research. So there's a figure from 2019 that 98% of autism research funding in America was focused on autistic children or their caregivers. So only 2% was focused on autistic adults. And although many autistic adults would like to be involved in research as people involved in shaping it as well as participants, we're routinely excluded. When I did my community consultation, I was thinking that my fellowship would focus on pregnancy and early parenthood. And then the community spoke, and they spoke very loudly and very clearly and said, but what about periods? What about contraception? What about menopause? Like, it's all really important. And around that time, there was a cover in the Lancet saying that we really needed more attention focused on periods. You know, we needed to think about gynecological health. So I was like, okay, right, I'm going to put this in and hopefully it'll be okay. So that was my rationale. I had 3 people peer review my application. One who later identified herself to me and told me she thought it was brilliant and she was really pleased it was funded, gave really lovely feedback saying it was outstanding, really innovative and creative. And the 2 other reviewers gave it kind of middle of the road ratings and feedback, but they were quite positivistic. So they said that I couldn't find out about autistic people's reproductive health without asking non-autistic people and comparing them. And that really wasn't where I was going. I really wanted to centre autistic people. And one of them also said that I didn't have an aim or research questions in my application. At Swansea, in my faculty, we have a brilliant man working in the research hub, Dominic Parks, and he said to me, Amy, I've seen it, you definitely put those in. And so fortunately, I went in, they were definitely in the application, and I put them on the slides just to show the panel that they were always there. And so the aim for my project then was to use participatory methods to create new knowledge about and to improve autistic people with wombs reproductive health. And I say autistic people with wombs because only 75% of autistic people are cisgendered. So that means they identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth. The other 25% are either trans, non-binary, or they have some other gender identity. So I would say that I'm agender, so I don't really feel like I have any gender, and that's kind of quite common in autistic people. So in our community consultation, it came across really strongly to use gender neutral language. So I used that throughout. So that's the aim. And then moving on to the research questions then, the first one is, what are the reproductive healthcare needs? So if we're going from menstruation to menopause, what needs are there at different points in the life course? And the second one was, how can the UK NHS better meet those needs? Because it's highly likely it's not being done well at the moment based on the research we know about autistic people's health and healthcare experiences. And the last research question is a methods one. So there is a really lovely research group in America called the Aspire Project, 2 A's at the beginning of Aspire, and it's led by Professor Christina Nicoladis and Dora Raymaker, so Dr. Dora Raymaker. And they have a community council that will guide each of their projects using participatory action research. And those methods have been used in the UK. There are lots of projects that are doing things well, but actually what I'm proposing is something huge and ambitious, and can we scale that up in a UK context? So those were my questions. And then this diagram on the next slide shows the study design. And because I wanted to make it clear in the interview panel's minds that this wasn't just something I'd come up with, I wrote really clearly at the top of the slide, this was developed in collaboration with the autistic community. So I had conversations with 27 autistic people with wombs about their reproductive health, about the research they would like to see done, and also through Health and Care Research Wales, I was able to pay for 2 autistic people to have quite in-depth input into the design of my study, and they are now still involved in the study, but that then meant that I could give the panel confidence that what I was saying I wanted to do was going to be acceptable to the community, so it wasn't going to immediately fail at the first hurdle. And then looking at the diagram, so the box on the far left, the initials there stand for community-based participatory action research. So it's often shortened to CBPR, community-based participatory research. And as you can see from the arrows, that feeds into the yellow box and the blue box. So I want that to feed in throughout. And the way that I'm going to make sure that autistic people are co-designing and co-governing the project is through developing an autistic research community council. And that's something that I don't think has happened before in Wales. The yellow box in the middle of the diagram then shows the data that I propose to collect. So I plan to use longitudinal visual methods interviews. So longitudinal means that you follow people up at multiple points in time, and I've proposed to follow people up for 10 interviews each, ideally. And then visual methods mean that instead of me asking people questions, that I'll give them some information beforehand and they can write, draw, collage, speak voice notes, whatever they want to do, to hold some of their thoughts about what's important about that topic for them. So we'll do these repeat interviews with a group of 100 autistic people with wombs. And to make sure we were covering that full life course, so we've expanded out, we're not just on pregnancy and maternity, I've spread that across the life course. So we've got a group of relatively young women, 2 groups between 22 and 40, so one that hasn't had children and one that's been recently pregnant, and then a group of people who are perimenopausal. So here I'm capturing hopefully a lot of what is going on in people's reproductive health, and those interviews will take place over 5 years. So we'll see a lot of change in people's lives over that time, as long as we design the study in a way that means people want to carry on doing it. And because anybody giving you money for research is going to be interested in the outputs and the impacts that you can create with that research, the 3rd box on the screen talks about what I plan to achieve. And that included public engagement, so trying to change the public's view of autism, as well as doing public engagement with autistic people so they can learn more about the research process in order to be able to more critically consume research that is about us. Also, I will have stakeholders involved in terms of those who deliver healthcare or policymakers, so those sorts of people. So by involving those 2 groups, it's really hoped that what I do will be able to have an impact, because it will be right for both the patient group and the clinicians. The third bullet point mentions a toolkit. So with that, I'm thinking that health services could do a self-assessment, identify areas of their practice where they're weak in supporting autistic people, and then they could have some tools available to improve that. And the aim of that is that it would ultimately improve healthcare for autistic people and better meet their needs. And lastly, as I mentioned before on the maroon box, this is Wales's first Autistic Research Community Council. So it's really important to evaluate how well that's working in a UK context when we're using it over such a long period. So something I mentioned at the beginning is that Professor Brown was my mentor for both fellowship applications, and that meant that I was linked into the LIFT Research Centre, which really excels in terms of translation, and that's a skill that I need to develop. I'm also linked to the Centre for Gender, Culture and Society here at Swansea University, so you can then see that there's a rich academic community around me. As well as the support from Swansea University, I also have support directly relating to autism, reproductive health and research methods. So on the slides, when somebody's name is in purple, that's because they are openly autistic. So when it comes to the organisations, you can see I've put their logos on the screen. So that's showing the weight of the support that I have behind me. You can see that it's come from various organisations in terms of autism, and that I have Wales's clinical lead on board. And then when it comes to reproductive health, you can see that I've got a broad range of expertise there, from midwives, health visitors, an organisation that advocates for fairer treatment when it comes to reproductive health, so fair treatment for the women of Wales, sexual health consultants, the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecology, and also Professor Fiona Woolard, who's a philosopher of reproductive health. So I'm spreading that expertise in lots of different directions there. And when it comes to methods, again, I've made sure I'm covering everything. So I have those participatory methods. I also have Health and Care Research Wales's PPI manager, Rebecca Burns, involved, and Dr. Helen Cara, who is internationally acknowledged as an expert in creative research methods. As I've mentioned before, Professor Brown supports with impact and public engagement, and then Professor Bick at Warwick is a professor of maternal trials. So if this toolkit becomes something that we think needs to be evaluated in a trial, I've got that expertise there from the off. So I've really got those experts in all directions covered. So I only had 10 minutes when I presented this to Wellcome, so I've spoken for longer describing the rationale behind some of these things. But I think this concluding slide is really important. So this famous slogan, "Nothing about us without us," that goes back to the 1960s and disability rights in the UK. Rebecca Ellis is a researcher, and she's also autistic and has an excellent Instagram account called Neurodivers, so divers as in deep sea divers. And this is one of Rebecca's drawings, and I thought it really spoke to what I wanted to do with my research. So Stuart Hall, famously talking about race in the media, says that, you know, that pictures can say things that you can't convey in words, and that's what I hope to do. So in this concluding slide, I tried reminding them about the 3 Ps, so the person, the place and the project. So I said that I was experience focused and highly motivated, that the project was creative, bold and ambitious, creating a significant shift in understanding. And some of those words are words from the Wellcome Trust's own documents about what they want fellows to do. I then said that I was working with the autistic community throughout, that I had a strong advisory board with a broad range of expertise, and that the outputs from the project would be a community council of autistic research people, and that would last beyond the project. There would hopefully be a reproductive health toolkit that should lessen health inequality, and that there would be unanticipated benefits for human health. And again, that's a phrase that Wellcome use. Wellcome are happy with high risk, high reward research. So being really broad and saying that I'm going to learn about the lives of these 100 autistic people in so much detail is something that is really up their street. And lastly, I said, if you give me this fellowship, this will cement my position as a leader and an innovator. So that was my Wellcome presentation. So going back then to bring this all together. So this was originally planned to be a talk at Swansea University, and there I was really going to recommend that people use the Research Hub. So I had a lot of support from Dominic Parks, from Kelly James, who's now moved faculties, and also Emma Baker. But talk to your research office. I had my application peer reviewed. I also had a mock interview, and those were really, really helpful for making me feel more confident for the actual interview. And thinking about your application, you really have to be the right person for the topic you're studying. So I think something that you need to be able to do, even if it doesn't end up in your application, is to craft a narrative of how you've got from getting your PhD to applying for this project. What are the things in your life, in your research career, and anything else that's relevant that mean you are exactly the right person to do this research, and that nobody else could do the project that you're proposing, or they couldn't do it as well as you. Next, if you're doing health research, you should be doing it with the community. Always, that should never be in doubt. And I would argue that so much PPI is tokenistic. Funders are happy to fund a lot of public involvement in research these days, so you should really be costing for that. And the NIHR rate is £25 per hour, sometimes seen as £75 per half day. But as well as having the community involved, you want to have the clinicians. You need to show that what you're proposing will be acceptable to the patients. They'll want to use that and it will meet their needs, but there won't be massive barriers within the way the health service is delivered that mean that clinicians just couldn't use it. So, that's just showing as well that your study will be feasible. You'll have support from the right people. Moving on to the fourth major bullet point then, you need to be really clear about the outputs and outcomes that you hope to achieve. So funders are going to want to show that you're doing things that are going to be valuable, so that the people that donate to them or the taxpayer are going to think that that was a really useful project. And my last point is to pay attention to the funders' guidance. So Wellcome wanted projects that would fundamentally shift the understanding of a phenomena, and they were also really open to unanticipated benefits. And I really played that up. I said, we don't know how many people will drop out because no one's tried to keep autistic people in a research project for 5 years when they can have quite a lot of control over how they do their interviews, so the mode of interview isn't fixed in my study. It can be whatever that participant wants. So they can type if they're non-speaking, or even if they just prefer typing, or they can record voice messages and the conversation can go backwards and forwards, but asynchronously, so people aren't having to think on the spot. So those are my key tips on how I think you can make yourself most likely to succeed in securing a fellowship, and my own experience with the Wellcome Career Development Award. This was planned to be a live event, so at this point I would have asked people if they had questions, but do feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. So my email address is Amy, AIMEE, .grant@swansea.ac.uk, and you can find me on Twitter at Dr. Amy Grant, and my inbox is open. So feel free to let me know if there are any questions, and thank you for your time.